Hi, everyone. Welcome to our second remote lecture. Realize this is not as good as being in the class where we can have discussions about these points, and a lot of this lecture actually includes some audience participation, particularly at the beginning, so we're not going to be able to do that, obviously. But just to remind you, this lecture is based on Chapter 3 in your book, Why People Believe Weird Things, How Thinking Goes Wrong. And chapters, I think it's 12 in The Believing Brain, Confirmations of Belief. Oh, and actually the last chapter of Why People Believe Weird Things, which I wrote for the second edition of this book, on why smart people believe weird things. That's the hard question. And parenthetically, the issue of Skeptic that I handed out to you all earlier with Steve Pinker's cover story on are we living in a post-truth world era, we're not living in a post-truth era, makes a case that our thinking doesn't go wrong all of the time, that there are tools that we'll be covering in this lecture and subsequent lectures to show how we can think more critically and scientifically to get around these cognitive biases. So this lecture, again, is cognitive biases and how thinking goes wrong and right. So we'll be showing that there is a optimistic view of this. Now, the problem I have here with the opening of this lecture is that I usually do this with an audience, and it's audience participation time. So here you should be seeing now the screen of this. We can't do this, obviously, you at home, but what I would normally do to show this effect, this is the first of the cognitive biases by way of demonstration. In experiment 1, what I do is divide the class into two groups, and no one talks. You're just going to watch the screen. Group 1 faces the screen, and then group 2 turns to the back of the room, and then everyone is silent. And then I have group 1 that's facing the screen read this question silently. Are there more than 100 countries in Africa? Please record your answer as yes or no. And then, again, everybody staying silent. Now, continue. Group 1, facing the screen. Please read this question silently. How many countries are there in Africa? Please record your answer as a number. Okay, got that? If you want to participate in that, go ahead and write down your number. You'll see the effect here in a moment. Continuing to be silent. Group 1, turn and face the back of the room. Group 2, turn forward and face the screen. Everyone remain silent. Now, Group 2, looking at the screen, please read this silently. Are there more than 10 countries in Africa? Please record your answer as yes or no. And then finally, in question B for Group 2, how many countries are there in Africa? Please record your answer as a number. Now, you can probably anticipate what's going on here. And welcome to an example of a powerful cognitive bias that causes our thinking to go wrong. This is called anchoring, the phenomenon in which having a number in mind, even an implausible one or one you consciously try to disregard, affects your thinking. So before the talk, I divided you into two groups. Each group silently read and answered two questions. The second question was, how many countries are there in Africa? There are currently 54 countries in Africa. The first question was different for the two groups. Group 1 saw this question, are there more than 100 countries in Africa? Group 2 saw this question, are there more than 10 countries in Africa? You can see where I'm going with this. What was the difference between Group 1 and Group 2? Well, historically, I've been doing this for many years. Just to show you one I did at a lawyer's conference. It was maybe, 100 people in the room or so. Group 1, that was primed with the 100 number, estimated there would be 45 countries in Africa. Group 2, that there were 23 countries in Africa. Again, Group 2 was primed with the number 10, Group 1 with the number 100. The last time I did this, when I taught at Claremont Graduate University, so these are graduate students, PhD students. Doesn't matter how smart you are, the effect is quite strong either way. 56 versus 34, and then over the years at Chapman University, here's just a few of the semesters. 54 versus 29, 69 versus 26, 59 versus 27, 62 versus 28. So that's pretty amazing that you could anchor somebody's estimate of something based completely on an arbitrary number. I just made up a number like that. In fact, this experiment has been done many, many times and has been well documented. For example, was Gandhi more or less than 214 years old when he died versus some lower number? I mean, it's just absurd. Of course, he wasn't 214 years old when he died. But just the higher the number you put in there, the older the age that subjects estimate he was when he died. Just yanks it up like that. Dan Ariely did this experiment in which he primed people with the last 2 digits of their Social Security number and then asked them to bid a price of a wine bottle. People that had a Social Security number between the last 2 digits, between 80 and 99, they bid $39 for a wine bottle. Those whose Social Security, last 2 digits of their Social Security number is between 0 and 19, bid $12. I mean, this is absurd. The last 2 digits of your Social Security number have nothing to do with the value of a bottle of wine. It's crazy. But that's the anchoring effect. This is why, by the way, restaurants often include a very expensive bottle of wine on the menu, so buyers will purchase up from the lower number. So you have like a $10 bottle and a $30 bottle and a $60 bottle and a $250 bottle. That $251 pulls people up to the higher bottle than they would have perhaps chosen. Obviously not always, but the effect is pretty strong. That's why sellers often start with a higher number because they want to pull you up. So you as the buyer want to start with the lower number. Prosecutors always ask for higher prison sentences, knowing that they're not going to get that higher number, but it'll pull the jury or the judge up to a higher number. Now, experiment 2, I have everybody in the room answer the following 3 questions, so you can play along with this one at home. What continent is Kenya in? What are the 2 opposing colors in the game of chess? Name any animal. Hopefully you're thinking zebra, which is what most people say, but only when they answer the first 2 questions before answering the third. By thinking about Africa and then the colors black and white, zebra is more available in memory. This is called the availability bias or heuristic. By the way, I'll be using these terms interchangeably. Bias implies it's a kind of a negative thing, like we're getting something wrong. Heuristic doesn't have that negative valence. It's a rule of thumb, a cognitive shortcut for rapid cognition, or what's sometimes called intuition. So we're going to see with Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman, their idea of a heuristic or rule of thumb is kind of a type 1 or rapid cognition, system 1 thinking, rapid cognition thinking, intuitive thinking, a heuristic. You can't do all the calculations, so you just have some rule of thumb to make a decision. The idea behind this is that we cannot possibly process all of the data and information coming in through our senses from the world, so we have to take shortcuts, and these are heuristics. So the availability heuristic in this case is that we judge the probability of events by the ease with which instances come to mind, like in the zebra example. So the brain's search engine results in images and anecdotes that pop into mind as you're doing if you say metaphorically, a search, that serve as surrogates for probabilities and statistics. And as we're going to see, we did not evolve the plains of Africa to understand large numbers, long-term trends, probabilities and statistics, Bayesian reasoning, all that we discussed in the first couple of lectures in the class. No, we have shortcuts. That's what these heuristics are. So, for example, we tend to fear things that immediately come to mind, something we just saw in the news, or that's particularly scary, like shark attacks, terrorist attacks, or in the case this month, the coronavirus pandemic. And that has to do with the news frequency of which we see things. So more examples of availability heuristic of how it can distort things. The number of people that die from automobile accidents worldwide annually is 1.25 million. Number of people that die in plane crashes worldwide annually is in the hundreds. Number of people that die in nuclear deaths in the last 60 years, that is the entire existence of nuclear power, is in the thousands. The number of people that die from coal-related deaths is over 1 million annually. And yet, people are still afraid of nuclear power, and they still seem to think it's better that we keep coal. Well, that's another debate. Terrorism. Fewer people die from terrorism than from lightning, collisions with deer, peanut allergies, bee stings, and ignition or melting of nightwear. In other words, people that probably fall asleep in their beds with a cigarette or on their couch. After 9/11, it was calculated that there were 1,500 excess deaths by car because of the fear of flying. In other words, so many accidents happen within a certain perimeter, say between your home and the airport, that you're more likely to be harmed driving than you are driving to your destination rather than flying to the destination. Anyway, speaking of availability, heuristic, and fear, so we tend to fear the familiar versus the unfamiliar. Better the devil you know than the devil you don't. Controlled versus imposed. That is, I should flip the valence there. That is, we're less likely to fear something we can control or that we're familiar with than that we're unfamiliar with or that we can't control or impose. So people tend to fear flying even though they really should fear driving. You're behind the wheel. You're controlling your car. You can't control the plane. Natural versus man-made. Say organic versus GMOs. We tend to fear GMOs more than organic foods, even though there's no evidence that GMOs cause harm. In terms of dreaded risk, things that are uncontrollable, potentially catastrophic, deadly, inequitable. And so I want to use a fun example here of horror films that capitalize on our fears and dial up the availability heuristic to 11. I was recently participated as a talking head in a documentary film called Cursed Films. So here's the idea that, I'll show you the trailer behind this. So it's a documentary about horror films that are cursed. Bad things happen with them. So here's the trailer for that. Okay. Well, yeah, here's the website for it, Cursed Films, and what the film is all about and so on. Here's the trailer for it.
We hear a lot about cursed films around horror productions. Crazy things that happen on the set of The Exorcist, or The Omen, or Poltergeist.
When you're working intensively on a project and something really anomalous occurs, it's tempting to say this project feels cursed.
There was all of this information about the movie being cursed.
And then you enter the internet into that.
Okay, everybody, we had a little technical glitch there. Let me pick it up again. I think it stopped recording during the Cursed Films trailer. Here is the trailer.
It's tempting to say this project feels cursed.
There was all of this information about the movie being cursed.
And then you enter the internet into that and forget about it.
There are rumors that they used real skeletons from India and it led to a curse.
If you need skeletons to come out of a muddy pool, what do? Well, get some real ones, I guess.
Our brains are designed to believe all sorts of things, whether they're poltergeists,
There was a moment during production when their sets caught fire.
aliens, and conspiracies.
Gregory Peck was supposed to be on a flight that he canceled. The plane crashed and killed everyone on board.
Angels and demons.
The Antichrist would do everything not to have this picture made. For me, that was in one ear and out the other.
It was the last night of shooting. It was the final scene with the rescue of the two children.
Things are getting too close to the helicopter. And I turn around and I said, run. They do the shot, and then he drops down, and he didn't get up.
I think it's easier for people to try to come up with some kind of conspiracy theory that helps justify why this person is suddenly gone.
There has to be a reason for something terrible happening. That's the crux of all this cursed thinking.
I think we bring on our own curses upon us. Otherwise, you have to believe that there are really demonic forces out there.
Okay, so how should we think about this claim? Are horror films cursed? So here's what I explained to them, and to my utter astonishment, they actually used this. I say utter astonishment because in my over quarter century of doing media about these kinds of things, the paranormal, the supernatural, and my job is to offer a scientific, rational explanation for the apparently irrational or paranormal. they almost always cut it out. Most producers think people don't want to know what the explanation is. So to their credit, they left this in. So I'm happy to show you what the explanation is here for this phenomenon. I would like you to think about putting those films that are cursed in a box. And we're going to put this box right here, and then we're going to draw a square around it, in which we have 3 other boxes. So in this box, number 1, we have cursed horror films, Poltergeist and The Crow and The Exorcist and so on. Now what I wanted you to think about is the second box over here, which are cursed non-horror films. Superman, Christopher Reeves fell off a horse, broke his neck, and Apocalypse Now, Martin Sheen has a heart attack, and all these weird things that happen. Okay, why aren't we talking about that cell? Because they're not horror films. In this box down here, I want you to think about non-cursed horror films, like The Shining.
Come and play with us, Daddy.
This is one of the scariest films ever made. No curses. Or, more recently, It. Or Get Out. Why don't we notice those? And then the fourth category, of course, is non-cursed, non-horror films. Pick any of them. Citizen Kane, Casablanca, people had long careers after that. Nothing weird happened. So you have to keep in mind all 4 categories and remind yourself, look, I'm only focusing on this one, but all the other ones, put it into context. And when you see the bigger picture, you realize, okay, there's actually nothing to be explained. There we go.
Seeing patterns.
So there's nothing to explain is the answer. That is, we're artificially focusing on just one particular cell instead of the others. Here's what it looks like if we put it into our familiar 2x2 matrix, which we did in one of our earlier lectures talking about signal detection. That is, which of the boxes is the correct one, which one should we be following. So here in the upper left, you have horror films that are cursed, as I said, and then horror films that are not cursed, and then non-horror films that are cursed, Superman, Wizard of Oz, Apocalypse Now, and so on, and non-horror, non-cursed films. That leaves nothing left to explain. So that familiar 2x2 matrix is a really great thinking tool, kind of a heuristic, as it were, for thinking about weird things and why they happen. Sometimes there's nothing to explain. So the representative bias or heuristic is that people judge the probability that an item belongs to a category or an event that was generated by a process according to how representative the item or event is. That is, how close it is to the prototype of the category. It's kind of a type of reasoning by stereotype. We talk about stereotyping as a form of prejudice, but in fact, most of our reasoning is done by stereotype. That is, we cannot sample every single item in the universe. We have to take a small sample and hope that our extrapolation from the sample to the larger population is an accurate one. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. When it isn't, we call it prejudice, but stereotyping is a normal form of reasoning. That is, we're asking about the similarity of the data that we've collected to the hypothesis, the generalization of the whole phenomenon that we're interested in. So recall that we talked in the last lecture on conspiracies about the conjunction fallacy, and I said I'd come back to that. The reason I want to come back to that is because I use it in a particular way that I'll repeat here in just a moment. But in terms of the representative heuristic, here's another way to think about it. What's more likely? So these are the kinds of questions you can ask subjects, and you get interesting answers. A nuclear weapon will be launched before 2024, or a nuclear weapon will be launched before 2024 by North Korea following a breakdown of talks and a military attack against North Korean targets, which Kim Jong-un mistakes for an all-out invasion. Now, you will recall from the conjunction fallacy that that 2 independent events, the probability of both of them happening at the same time is different from either one of them happening individually. So, of course, it's more likely that a nuclear weapon will be launched before 2024 somewhere in the world than that it's done in North Korea, because there's so many other options around the world other than North Korea. So the conjunction fallacy, most famously, as I described it last time and is done by Tversky and Kahneman, this is the so-called Linda problem. Linda is 31 years old, single, outspoken, and very bright. She majored in philosophy. As a student, she was deeply concerned with issues of discrimination and social justice, and also participated in anti-nuclear demonstrations. So, subjects were asked, what's more probable, that Linda is a bank teller or that Linda is a bank teller and active in the feminist movement? Most people say the second one because the description seems to fit that when you give that kind of representativeness, more detail to make it seem more representative of the larger sample there of let's say, the feminist movement and activism. But it can't be. Again, here's why it can't be. The majority of those asked, chose option 2. However, the probability of 2 events occurring together in conjunction is always less than or equal to the probability of either one occurring alone. Okay, just repeating what I just said. So here's the calculation. For example, even choosing a very low probability of Linda being a bank teller, say probability Linda is a bank teller is 0.05, and a high probability that she would be a feminist, say 0.95, then assuming independence, the probability of Linda being a bank teller and Linda being a feminist is 0.05 times 0.95, or 0.075, which is lower than the probability of Linda being a bank teller alone. So that shows you why we have to recalibrate our thinking and use, as I'm going to get to in a moment, system 2 thinking, rational calculations, rather than system 1, our intuitive, heuristic, rapid cognition. Okay. So Tversky and Kahneman argue that most people get this problem wrong because they use a heuristic, an easily calculated procedure, again, called representativeness to make this kind of judgment. Option 2 seems more representative of Linda based on the description of her, even though it is clearly mathematically less likely. Now, to repeat myself, because the 9/11 truthers have just been on the scene for far too long here, and why they can't be right. That is, we know the planes hit the World Trade Center buildings. That's 100%. Although there are those who are far out on the conspiracy spectrum that think it's possible that there were no planes, that it was all done by holograms, or the footage was all faked or whatever. But even most 9/11 truthers, the hardcore ones, they debunk that. They don't accept that. So the idea that in addition to the planes crashing in the buildings, that it was also controlled demolition as an inside job by the Bush administration can't be. It cannot possibly be that, for just because they're independent events. Now, if you want to say they're actually dependent, that Bush did everything, he controlled the planes and the whole thing, okay, then that would be a different calculation. But as independent events, the probability of either one of them being true is more likely than both of them being true. Okay, and that's not to say that we don't have evidence otherwise that Al-Qaeda did it, because of course we do. Anyway, here is the famous Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman in their youth. Sadly, Amos Tversky's no longer around. He died early, I think at age 51. But their most famous paper here was titled Judgment Under Uncertainty, Heuristics and Biases. Subtitle, Biases and Judgments Reveal Some Heuristics of Thinking Under Uncertainty. It's kind of repetitive. They have an edited volume with the thousands of experiments that have been done over the decades called Judgment Under Uncertainty, Heuristics and Biases. You get the idea. This is one of the most cited papers in all of psychology, and this is one of the more cited edited volume scholarly books on the subject. And they identify these 3 cognitive heuristics: the anchoring bias or heuristic, the availability bias heuristic, and the representative bias heuristic, which we just covered. So Tversky and Kahneman heuristics has a rule of thumb or cognitive shortcut for rapid cognition or intuition, or what they call System 1 versus System 2. Okay, I've repeated this often. The best explanation of this, there's Danny Kahneman more recently, is his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, which I've read, and I hosted Danny at Caltech for one of our public events, which you can find online. And he's really quite the thinker and influential scholar of this area. He is the first psychologist to win the Nobel Prize, which there is no Nobel Prize in psychology, but in economics there is. So he won it for economics because of this whole theory of how it affects our behavior in the marketplace. So that's developed the field of behavioral economics. Anyway, System 1 is rapid cognition, the kinds of stuff we've just seen the first part of this lecture. System 2 is this more deliberative, rational, calculating, utility maximizing part of our cognition that we want to develop, but that takes some effort. That's the idea. So Danny's book really goes through all that. I recommend that. For example, they have, amongst the many examples, framing effects. If you were at a store where an item cost $100, would you walk 6 blocks to purchase that same item for $50? Okay, most people go, yeah, half off. That's great. I'll do it. Another group of subjects is asked, if the item were $1,000 at the first store and $950 at the other store, would you walk the 6 blocks? Amazingly, most people say they wouldn't bother, even though it's the same $50. So framing it with a different number changes how you evaluate it. And, of course, that has all sorts of implications for marketing and sales in economics. So there's another way to think of it. Are these cognitive biases or heuristics? Are they features or bugs? I'm arguing that they're features. They're not bugs. They're built into the system, and they work under certain conditions. They work pretty well. Type 1 thinking that works good enough in natural environments is where the system 1 or type 1 that can be fooled in artificial environments. So, for example, illusions are byproducts of mechanisms that recover 3D shape in the world from a 2D retinal image. For example, the Ponzo illusion. Okay, where I'm going with this is that cognitive illusions are not unlike optical illusions. So optical illusions fool us because of the cues we use to perceive depth in a three-dimensional field that we're looking at, which is, the photons are falling on a two-dimensional, essentially a flat surface where our rods and cones are. So this is the Ponzo illusion, where the upper yellow line looks a lot longer than the bottom yellow line, even though, as you can guess by now because you're all familiar with this, they're the same length. So here's a better example, I think, that shows the effect. This is just a picture I took at the train tracks in Montecito up here near Santa Barbara. So I'm going to take this. Let me make my little laser pointer here. So here I'm gonna copy this board right here and move it up here, and you'll see it's the exact same. You can tell just border to border, it's the exact same length of that, but it looks a lot longer than this one. The upper one looks a lot longer than the bottom one. Okay, now so people that like to show these optical illusions, how foolish our brains are, or how easy it is to fool humans and so on. And often at this point, people will show magic tricks or whatever. This is how magicians fool people. But you're not really being fooled. It's not really a bug. Normally, if you see a board that has this kind of converging lines around it and shorter boards around it, would be longer. So your perception that it's longer than this board is not that you're being fooled. It's that you're correctly perceiving the environment in front of you. Anyway, that's my take on this. So are cognitive illusions like perceptual illusions, that is, byproducts of adaptive cognitive mechanisms? I think sometimes they are, sometimes they're not. So sometimes this is called bounded rationality. That is, there are limitations to our information processing. So we're rational, but it's a bounded rationality depending on the environment. Come back with examples of that. Sometimes it's called motivated reasoning. That is, winning arguments rather than trying to determine truth. So again, the point of this course is, what is truth? Sometimes, or a lot of times, we argue about things not to determine the truth, but to win the argument, which has to do with our tribal solidarity. That is, we're tribal social primate species that belong to tribes. So our rationality is expressive of something else rather than the search for truth. It's signaling to our fellow tribe members that we toe the line that way. Anyway, to counter in sort of criticisms of Tversky and Kahneman, Gert Gingerenzer's book, Gut Feelings, and he's had several books since then, but I read this one, I think it was the late 90s or so, when he first started thinking about what the problem was with Tversky and Kahneman's line of reasoning, which is that we are irrational by nature and that system 2 almost always runs the show. And Gingerenzer says, I don't think so. I think he points that we're not that dumb or irrational. And the reason is because modern probability theory developed in the 18th century, large data sets and computers in the 20th century, and our heuristics as adaptive rules of thumb using information available in a natural environment may not be irrational. I mean, we evolved these things over millions of years of perceiving and analyzing the world. And so we we analyze events, not statistics, and we solve social problems, not probability problems. And in conjunction with Gingerins or Tooby and Cosmides, that is, I think I have a picture of them here in a moment, they have what they call a cognitive niche. That is, our brains evolved in these social environments, physical environments, that is a niche environments for cognition. And so the most famous example of this is the Wasson logic puzzle. Here are Lita Cosmidi and John Tooby. They are the founders of evolutionary psychology, or two of the founders anyway, up here at UC Santa Barbara, along with Don Simons and Napoleon Chagnon and many others, Steve Pinker at Harvard. And so here's how they think about this test. Now, here are 4 cards, D, F, 3, and 7. Here's the rule. Every card has a letter on one side and a number on the other side. The rule is, if a card has a D on one side, then it has a 3 on the other side. Is this true or false? So here's our D, here's our 3. So the question is, which cards, what's the minimum number of cards you need to turn over to test the rule? So the rule is, if a card has D on one side, then it has a 3 on the other. Is this true or false? Which cards do we need to turn over to answer that question? Most people say D, or D and 3. But the correct answer is D and 7. Why? Because we want to test the hypothesis. That is, we want to try to falsify it, not just confirm it. So but part of the problem is that, so Tversky and Kahneman would say, we're just, this sort of system 1 is just wants to confirm the hypothesis, confirmation bias, for example. We'll talk about that later. But in fact, let's restructure the problem, say, Tooby and Cosmides. Let's say the rule is, if a bar patron is drinking beer, he must be over 21. You are a bouncer in a bar to enforce the rule. Who should you check? Someone drinking beer? So somebody sitting there drinking beer, how old are they? 2, someone drinking Coke, how old are they? 3, someone who is over 21, what is he drinking? And someone who is under 21, what is he drinking? See, here, it's not a weird logic puzzle. It's a social problem. The correct answer is, you want to check someone who's drinking beer, how old are they? And someone who's under 21, what's he drinking? That's the correct answer. That's the same as the Wasson puzzle. And so as Tooby and Cosmides showed, and then Gingerins emphasizes this point, is that far more people get this answer, this puzzle correct, than the original Wasson test. They're the same test. So if you structure problems in a way that engage the human mind for what it was evolved to do, then we're not that dumb. We're not that irrational. So this is sometimes called the content effect. People are illogical with abstract symbols, but logical with proper content. The proper content in this case being our social environment. And the thing is, again, one of the keys to science that I've been emphasizing in this course is we need to try to falsify our hypotheses, not confirm our hypotheses. It's easy to confirm hypotheses, particularly with the confirmation bias. So our hypotheses need to be the puzzles need to be structured in a way that makes sense for the human brain to try to falsify them. And you recall in the first lecture of the course, I talked about Karl Popper and his falsification, his claim that is, we cannot prove scientific theories because of Hume's problem of induction. There might be exceptions. For example, you can have all the white swans you want and find another white swan and another white swan to confirm your hypothesis that all swans are white, but it takes one black swan to falsify it. And science works by falsification. So we try to falsify our theories. Those theories that have been tested, that is, attempts have been made to falsify them, and it still stands that we can offer our provisional assent that it may be true. So remember, that was my definition of truth in the first lecture of the course. Something confirmed to such a degree that it would be reasonable to offer our provisional assent, a modified version of Steve Gould's definition of facts in science. Okay, experiment 3, here we go. Both groups participate. Both groups are looking at the screen. I want you to study these words for 30 seconds. Go. Okay. Now, think of all the words from the list that you can recall and write them down. Okay, you at home, go ahead and do that if you like. Give you 30 seconds on that. Okay. Write down any of the following words that you're confident were on the list. Taste, point, sweet. Could be one of them, could be two of them, could be all three of them were on the original list. Experiment 3 here involves memory. Unlike a computer or a video camera, our memory of information is influenced by many psychological effects. In this case, note the original words and what the theme, one of the themes, strong themes there, candy and sugar and good and taste and honey and chocolate and cake and pie. Okay, you get the theme there. So the words taste, point, and sweet. What was our original words there? So there they are. Sorry. So taste is on there. Point is pointless because it's not part of the theme. And sweet should be on there. And most subjects think sweet was on the original list. It wasn't, as you can see here. But the reason we remembered it being there is because of the emotional themes or the emotional valence of the sequence of words. Okay, that's disturbing. Our memories are not good. So, for example, memory distortions like inattentional blindness, where you don't see something that's obvious right in front of you. There's a famous experiment based on this that I included and we reproduced in our session in that documentary. So I'm going to show you this clip, which was at 17:10, something like that. Let's see here. Show you this.
And supernatural ideas. And so when you watch these movies, it just kind of puts you in the right mindset to want to see patterns or to believe in conspiracies or to believe in curses.
With the omen, what you have is a series of coincidences or incidents then that people then weave into a narrative about a curse.
That's what coincidence theory is about. It was just trying to get connections between what is rational and what is weird. And, on the one hand, rational can look weird too.
Our brains are designed to believe all sorts of things, whether they're ghosts, poltergeists, angels and demons and gods and aliens and conspiracies. We evolved this propensity to just see patterns everywhere. Just assume everything is connected. Okay, we're about to show you a short clip of 3 basketball players dressed in black and 3 basketball players dressed in white. Each of them is passing a basketball back and forth between themselves. Your task is to count the number of passes between just the 3 white-shirted players. All right, you ready? Go. How many of you saw the gorilla? What? What gorilla? Here it is again. I'll rewind it. Oh, come on. That's a different tape, Shermer. No, it's the same one. So the famous gorilla experiment, this was done by Christopher Chabris and his team, in which they were testing to what extent people do not see things in their environment. It's like, how could you miss a gorilla? Well, 50% of subjects don't see the gorilla. And the reason is because they're attending to counting the number of passes. And by being focused on one thing, you might miss something that's completely obvious right there in front of you. Half. This is interesting cognitively because it shows how much we miss that's right there in front of us. Not only do we see things that are not real, we miss things that are real. Now, we're talking about cursed horror films. Okay, so that's where we left off that last one. In the context of thinking about what's true, again, we see things that are not true, we miss things that are true. That's a signal detection problem. Back to our earlier lecture on this, we want to know, which of the 4 cells that you have up there in front of you are the ones we should be focused on. Another one of these memory distortions is change blindness. This is the example from my friend Richard Wiseman, who is a cognitive psychologist and magician. So this is a terrific video here in which he shows how distorting this could be. Oops, sorry. Try that again.
Hi, I'm Richard, this is Sarah, and we're going to perform the amazing colour-changing card trick with this blue-backed deck of cards. Now the idea is very simple. I'm just going to spread the cards in front of Sarah and ask her to push any card towards the camera.
Right, okay, let's see. I'm going to go for this card here.
Okay. Now Sarah could have selected...
Okay. Let's try that again. Having trouble with the recording here.
any card at all from the deck, but she selected the card which is now face down on the table.
Okay, having technical problems here. Let's try this again.
What I'm going to ask her to do is show us which card she selected.
Right, so the card that I chose was in fact the 3 of diamonds.
Okay, I'm not sure why we're getting this effect, but we'll just keep trying.
The 3 of diamonds, okay, an excellent choice. That card goes back into the deck. Now I'm just going to spread the cards face up on the table. Do a little click of the fingers. And you'll see that Sarah's card here has now got a blue back. Not particularly surprising. What's slightly more surprising is all of the other cards have got red backs. And that is the amazing colour-changing card trick. Hi, I'm Richard, this is Sarah, and we're going to perform the amazing colour-changing card trick with this blue-backed deck of cards. Now the idea is very simple. I'm just going to spread the cards in front of Sarah and ask her to push any card towards the camera.
Right, okay, let's see. I'm going to go for this card here.
Okay. Now Sarah could have selected any card at all from the deck, but she selected the card which is now face down on the table. And what I'm going to ask her to do is show us which card she selected.
Right, so the card that I chose was in fact the 3 of diamonds.
The 3 of diamonds, okay, an excellent choice. That card goes back into the deck. Now I'm just going to spread the cards face up on the table. Do a little click of the fingers, and you'll see that Sarah's card here has now got a blue back. Not particularly surprising. What's slightly more surprising is all of the other cards have got red backs. And that is the amazing colour-changing card trick.
And hopefully you saw the gorilla sitting in the background there, which is pretty crazy. We did a replication of the famous change blindness experiments for a Dateline NBC episode. It was actually a two-hour special that I worked on with the producers and Chris Hansen. Okay. Okay, we've been having some technical difficulties here. We've been talking about cognitive biases and memory problems and change blindness. And I was starting to tell you about our replication we did of a number of famous psych experiments, including Milgram shock experiment, which I'll save for another lecture, with Chris Hansen and Dateline NBC. So here's the clip from the change blindness replication we did. The show is called Did You See That?
I immediately thought it was a woman's butt.
We've been showing you how our eyes don't always take in what's right in front of us.
11.
How we can be tricked into missing key parts of the big picture. Here's another example.
Excuse me, I'm sorry, can you help me?
This woman, Amy, is asking a random person on the street for directions. Without warning, they are rudely interrupted by a gigantic poster of me.
Where is it?
The man doesn't notice he's now speaking to a different person.
It's an N6?
It says 20 or 15 bucks that way.
Watch, we'll do it again.
Sorry, would you be able to get me to the Empire State Building?
This time we ask a woman for directions.
I think we're right here.
Let me see.
After a few seconds, we make the switch.
I'm sorry, keep going which way?
Let me see.
She doesn't notice either. Okay, so maybe we are stacking the deck a bit. The women do have similar hair and are wearing the same dress. What will happen if we switch a blonde with a brunette who's wearing totally different clothes?
Do you know where the subway is? Like, if I go to Grand Central Station, how do I get on there?
Here comes the poster, and the women switch places.
What am I doing here?
The stranger keeps on giving directions.
Her mind has already formed an image of what the person looks like, and she's not expecting some other image to suddenly appear there, because that never happens in the real world. So the brain just processes that and moves on to the next thing.
Excuse me? I'm sorry. Can you help me? Sure.
I don't even need the map.
Oh, okay. I need to go to, like, Grand Central Station.
The next woman gets so annoyed about being interrupted by the poster.
Sorry. That was rude. Can you tell me exactly where I'm going?
Okay, so...
She doesn't notice she's now talking to a woman who looks completely different.
Sir, can you help me?
Now let's really mix it up. A woman starts asking for directions. Here comes the poster.
Wait, but where am I right now? Oh.
And now a man takes her place. Our subject looks puzzled for a second, but continues to give directions.
This is 50th Street. Grand Central, it's 5 block down. All right.
Of course, not everyone was fooled.
So, you were saying? How do you get there? So you were saying?
I think...
Sorry. Can you tell me where I'm going?
Where you go? I have no clue where you're going. I know you interrupted the conversation I was having with that lady, but that's okay.
Could be size difference. It could be they were just looking at a certain way, or they weren't paying attention to what was being said. They were noticing how the person was dressed, and all of a sudden they're dressed differently. Most people, most of the time, don't notice it, but every once in a while somebody does.
Now it's my turn to give it a try.
Excuse me, Union Square? How do I get there?
Union Square.
A Dateline intern starts asking for directions. Then I step in. Will she notice I took his place?
Oh my goodness.
What?
You're playing tricks on me.
You noticed. You're pretty observant.
Yes, because everybody thinks.
You had to walk, actually, let me think.
What about this woman?
Here, this is 50th.
Excuse me? Sorry.
She keeps right on giving directions.
That way?
Yes, like 2 avenues.
And this is the Waldorf Astoria?
How is this possible?
Well, how many times does Chris Hansen suddenly appear in your scene standing there right before you? I mean, almost never. And so why would anybody expect that? So this is the power of expectation.
Well, you're up here.
We try it 2 more times.
Okay, this goes on and on like this. So the point, of course, that I'm making with this is that we're not that dumb. I mean, it's not like people are fooled, because that, again, doesn't happen in our natural environment. And that's the point. It's not it's a feature of our cognition. It's not a bug. It's not like something went wrong. Okay, we did a part 2 of this in another setting here. Let's see.
Do you know how to get to Union Square?
Yes.
We've been showing you how our eyes may not be as reliable as we think.
Actually, from here, this is...
While this example may be amusing, what it can mean in the real world is no laughing matter. Take the story of Ronald Cotton, convicted of 2 rapes and burglaries in the mid-1980s.
I
picked out my rapist.
After this woman picked him out of a lineup, he was convicted and locked away for 10.5 years. It took DNA evidence to prove his innocence.
I'm here to tell you that eyewitnesses can make mistakes.
This is a photo of the real rapist, and this is a photo of the man wrongly accused. Would you have made the same mistake? Experts in this field say you probably would.
We are not reliable memory machines. All this information is flowing through our senses. 99% of it, we just flows in and flows out, it's gone.
To test the accuracy of eyewitness testimony, we're here at a Mailboxes Etc. in New York City, about to do another demonstration. Just like the two men who resembled each other in that criminal case, we're using two Dateline interns who also resemble each other, but are clearly not twins. One woman is taller and has shorter hair. The other woman has freckles, and her shirt is a different color. You probably think you could tell them apart, but under the right circumstances, we're betting you couldn't. Just watch.
Hi. Will you just sign this, please?
This woman has agreed to fill out a survey concerning the recent oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. Our first intern, Blake, takes her form.
Thank you. Let me just get your survey.
Then she drops down behind the counter to get a survey. But she's not the person who pops back up. It's actually the other intern, Sophia.
Can you just fill this out in the background, please? Thank you.
Did the woman notice she's now interacting with a totally different person? Apparently not.
Hi.
How about this man?
Would you mind signing this first, please?
All right, sign my life away.
No. Okay.
Blake has him sign the consent form.
Thank you. I'm just going to get your survey.
Okay.
And again, she drops down, and Sophia appears.
Here's your $5.
Thank you.
And survey.
All right.
Can you just fill it out in the back, please? Just right around that corner there.
He doesn't notice, and it's not because he didn't look each woman straight in the eye. Here he is looking right at Blake, and then when Sophia takes her place, he looks right at her, but his brain is simply not realizing that they are two different women.
Hi.
This next woman, we find out later, is a Harvard grad who scored a 1600 on her SATs. Will that make a difference?
Okay, how long does it take?
She looks right at Blake.
Quick. Thank you. I'm just going to get your survey.
Okay. Is it cool if I start mailing this stuff?
Then right at Sophia. No reaction.
If you could just fill it out around the back, please. Just right around the corner there. Okay, thank you.
Hey, how are you?
Hi.
Chris Hansen with Dateline NBC.
I asked the Harvard grad about her experience.
What did you notice about the young woman at the counter when you walked in? Anything at all?
Not really.
And as is often done in criminal cases, I show her a photo lineup and ask if she can pick out the woman she just saw in the other room.
I'm gonna go with her first choice and her second choice.
She picks Blake first, then Sophia.
You are absolutely right, except about one thing. There were actually two different women. So one actually took the document, bent down, and it was a different woman who stood up.
Really?
You picked the right two.
Whoa.
You just didn't realize it was two different women.
Two different people. Hi, I'm Sophia.
So we introduce her to the two women.
So does it surprise you seeing them together that you didn't tell the difference?
It surprises me now, yes.
We try it again.
Hi. Can you sign this for me, please?
This man signs the form.
Let me just get your survey. Thank you.
All right, great. Got your survey here. $5. Can you fill this out in the back for me, please?
Yeah, no problem. Just right back here on the corner?
Yeah, just go right around the corner.
You got it. Thank you.
Yep.
And has no clue that the women switched.
Do you think you would recognize the young woman to whom you talked at the counter?
Yes, I would, I think.
How convinced are you?
80% chance.
Jack, will you look at a lineup for me?
Sure. I would say top left corner.
He picks Sophia, the second woman he spoke to.
Did you see anything strange while you were talking to the young woman? Did you notice anything?
No.
Well, let me tell you something, Jack. This was the first woman you talked to. And this was the second woman you talked to. There were actually two.
That is ridiculous. Wow.
What does that say?
That says that I wasn't paying very close attention. You take what's in front of your eyes, and they're not supposed to lie to you. But obviously they can.
We tried the switch 7 times, and even though the participants had encountered 2 women, they still believed they'd only met one. Which one? Point it out for me. When we asked each person to pick out the woman they thought they'd met from our group of photographs, 3 picked out Blake, 3 picked out Sophia. Then there's this woman. Did you notice anything odd between the time she bent down to give you the survey and the time she stood back up?
No.
Same girl.
Same girl.
Positive?
Yeah.
How positive are you?
100%.
100%.
100%.
But watch what happens when I ask her to pick out the woman she just spoke with.
I don't think any of them.
You don't think any of them?
No.
It's time to explain the trick to her. This young woman is the one you first talked to. When she bent down, it was this young woman who stood back up. 2 young women.
Okay.
Then I introduce her to the women in the photos. Can you tell the difference now?
Yeah.
And when this man looks at the photo lineup, he picks out a completely different woman.
I say the one on the bottom.
This one right here?
Yes.
How certain are you?
I'm pretty certain. I'm wrong.
You're wrong. And what does he think when he meets the women?
Hi. Thank you for tricking me.
Can you tell the difference now?
Yes.
Everyone was surprised they didn't notice the switch.
Oh, interesting.
There were actually 2 young women, you see? We played the old switcheroo on it.
Wow.
Did you have any inkling at all?
Not at all, actually.
Obviously, Blake and Sophia have some similarities, but we wanted to take it a step further. We tried it one more time using a Dateline staffer, DJ, who bore absolutely no resemblance to Blake.
Hi. Can you sign this for me, please? Thank you. I'm just going to get your survey.
Blake takes the survey and ducks down. Here comes DJ.
Okay, here's your $5. Survey. Could you go around the corner and fill that out for me, please? Thank you.
Is it possible he was fooled? I asked him to describe the woman he met at the counter.
She seems like an attractive woman. Brown hair.
Brown hair. Age?
She seems like mid-20s, maybe?
Mid-20s. When I show him the photos, he picks Blake, the first woman he saw. Well, you're half right.
Am I?
That was the young woman you talked to first.
Yes.
But I want to introduce you to somebody else. This is the first woman you talked to. When we show him Blake and DJ side by side, he doesn't believe us.
It's true. Is that really true?
It's true. We have it on video. I watched it.
Can I watch it?
Sure. So we show him the videotape.
Oh my God. I didn't believe it at first, but I guess I have to now.
Of course, these were brief encounters. But what if you were really trying to get to know someone, like on a date?
I'm Jeff. What's your name? Paulina.
Could someone possibly miss the old...
Okay, so we did it a third set of experiments at a speed dating site in New York City. Anyway, I won't show you that. It's all right. Point is made. That our memories, again, are not like video cameras, and but again, it's not like we evolved to see this kind of stuff. So the problem here is that this is the kind of thing that leads to false memories, which is one thing if it's harmless, but as the great Elizabeth Loftus has shown in decades of her research on memory, it's easy to get people to believe something happened to them, even something that obviously never happened. Here's a little clip of Elizabeth's research on that.
Can you go so far as to suggest an entire memory of something that never happened?
Chris is the subject of a false memory experiment. The Loftus researchers had several of his family members record in a journal some real events shared by the family. A false event, being lost in a shopping mall at the age of 5, was added to the journal, which Chris read and ultimately remembered as real.
I remember getting lost and I was crying, and I remember that day I was so scared I thought I'd never see my family again. I knew I was in real trouble. I remember the stores, vaguely. I sort of remember the stores. An older man approached me. He was tall, and I don't know his age, but he was older. He had a flannel shirt on. I remember the flannel shirt. And I remember my mom told me never to do that again. And,
Well, in terms of Chris's memory, there was no man, there was no flannel shirt, there was no mother who said, don't ever do this again.
Using deception in psychological research is a controversial but sometimes unavoidable practice. When the Loftus research team informed Chris that they had implanted a false memory, they followed a debriefing procedure designed to minimize any distress that participating in the study might have caused.
If there were 3 words that I would come up with to describe what memory is, I would say memory is suggestive, it's subjective, it's malleable.
So the problem is obvious when you're talking about something like eyewitness testimony, and that earlier quip talked about Ronald Cotton and Jennifer Thompson. So I met them. I took this picture at a conference where we were all speaking. They were on a tour for her book, which was called Picking Cotton, and that she picked him out of a lineup incorrectly, and now they're good friends. But it's a tragic story. And I mean, just it was like at the end of this talk, the audience was just completely enraptured. Because basically he forgave her, and they have developed this friendship, and it's a great example of restorative justice after something harmful is done, and how people can get over that. But the context here, it's not like in the change blindness experiments where something really did happen, and you just mixed up 2 people. In the case of false memories, these are things that never happened, and this is an example of both of these occurring. And this became really dangerous with the so-called recovered memory movement in the 1990s, when adult children were doing these therapy sessions in which they would sort of regress back to their childhood through question and answers with the therapist, who would ask them to recover a memory of being sexually molested as an explanation for whatever their current adult problems were. And we now know this is not at all reliable, again, because the idea is that there's a little homunculus in the head in front of a screen, like the Cartesian theater, watching the tape of the past play so they can report what's going on. Of course, nothing like this at all, not even metaphorically. It's not even remotely close to what memory is like. It's this malleable, subjective recall of something that may or may not have even happened. And in the case of Ronald Cotton, he spent 11 years in prison because she incorrectly picked him out of a lineup. And it's an incredible story. I was in my class, I sometimes show this 60 minutes piece. It's a little long, so I think I'll skip that because the point is made. So let's switch to another problem, folk innumeracy. That is to say, to what extent we misperceive and miscalculate probabilities. We think anecdotally instead of statistically. We focus on short-term trends and small number runs. We notice a short stretch of cool days and ignore the long-term global warming trend. We note recent downturn in the housing and stock markets, forgetting the half-century upward-pointing trend line. And our senses are geared to focus on each tooth's up or down angle and ignore the overall trend. Again, the point of this is that I think I'm more on the side of Gert Gingerenzer than Tversky and Kahneman, that these are features of our cognition that are tricked like optical illusions into thinking we're not that smart. But as Richard Dawkins points out, we evolved in middle land, as he calls it, middle land of the plains of Africa, where we're used to seeing things that are kind of a middling size between, say, ants and mountain ranges, or that move at a middling speed, say between walking and running, or between the speed of a cheetah and the speed of a snail, something like that. So the idea of like quantum physics and the speed of light and expanding universe and or in this case like global warming, it's hundreds of years or thousands of years. We're not geared by our evolved cognition to intuitively grasp what that means. That's why gambling, the stock market, the theory of evolution, climate change, these are difficult things for our intuitions to grasp, which is why we need science. You don't see species change. We don't, not even in a lifetime. It takes careful experiments in labs with rapidly breeding organisms to see evolutionary change, or you have to intuit it from the fossil record, from genetics, and so on. So our folk innumeracy is really just our evolved cognition. Here's the metaphor. This was an illustration from one of my Scientific American columns on the problem. So we focus on that. Go back to my laser light here. We focus on these little short-term downward trends. We don't see the long upward slope of the saw, just the sawtooth blades. Okay. So take something like death dreams. It's kind of a favorite example of mine because I'm often asked, how do you explain something? I had this dream last night about my grandmother dying, and then the next morning, my mom told me that grandma died last night. Oh my God, what time was it? It was like 3. Oh, I think that's when I had that dream. What are the chances of that? Well, intuitively, it seems like chances are pretty low that it could be a coincidence. Therefore, maybe there's something, some quantum field or some synchronicity or some connectedness between us all in the ether somehow. But no, actually, if you do the back of the envelope calculations like I did here, let's say we each have 5 dreams a night. You actually have more than that, but let's just use a conservative number 5. That's 1,825 dreams a year. Let's say you remember 1 out of 10 of them. And that's 182.5 remembered dreams a year. When I did the calculation, it was 295 million Americans. Just say it's 295 million adults that dream and talk about their dreams. That's 53.8 billion remembered dreams a year. We know from evolutionary psychologists and sociologists, social psychologists, that each of us knows about 150 people fairly well. This is the Dunbar number, 150 plus or minus a dozen or so. And this holds steady over, all walks of human life. And that is, most human collectives operate best at that number, 150 plus or minus a few dozen. At that, we have a network grid of 44.3 billion personal relationships. I then took the average annual U.S. death rate, all causes, all ages, and so forth, which is 0.008, or 2.6 million people die each year. It is inevitable that some of those 53.8 billion remembered dreams will be about some of these 2.6 million deaths among the 295 million Americans and their 44.3 billion relationships. In fact, it would be a miracle if some death premonitions did not come true. So here's a show you'll never see on Oprah. Next on Oprah, we have this woman that's had these death dreams, and so far not one of them has come true. Stay tuned and see if the next one does. Okay, that's a kind of back-of-the-envelope calculation of how to think about these kind of large numbers. Or another one is miracles. Well, what do you mean by a miracle? Well, let's define a miracle as 1,000,000 to 1 odds of something happening. Well, we see and hear things happen about 1 per second. There's 30,000 seconds in an 8-hour day. Let's say you're walking around for 8 hours paying attention, taking in information. That's 1,000,000 events per month. Most of those are completely insignificant, and you forget about them. But we would expect about 1 miracle to happen every month on average. And with the confirmation bias dialed up to 11, we remember the unusual and forget the usual. We remember the incredible dream that came true. We forget the thousands of dreams we've had that never came true, totally nonsensical, made no sense at all. So here's my little humorous clip to demonstrate this fellow who just did not understand 1,000,000 to 1 odds. Okay, wait a minute here. Get that. Here it is. Oh, I don't have that clip. Darn. Okay, that's too bad because this is the, maybe I do. Nope. Okay, I do have that clip here, actually. That's the Dumb and Dumber clip. It's pretty funny. Oh, no, I don't have the volume for it. Okay, that's too bad. Well, you remember this from Dumb and Dumber where he says, what are my chances? And she says, not good. And he says, you mean like 1 out of 100? And she says, more like 1 out of 1,000,000. And he says, So you're telling me there's a chance? No. Okay, moving on. The Monty Hall problem is another example often used to show how bad at reasoning we are, but that's really not the case. So anyway, the Monty Hall problem, Monty Hall was the host of this famous television game show that ran for decades called Let's Make a Deal. So imagine you're in the audience looking at the stage where Monty Hall is standing, and behind him is 3 doors. Behind one door, you're told, is a car. Behind the other 2 doors are goats. This assumes you prefer cars to goats. Now, Monty knows what's behind all 3 doors, and Monty will not reveal what's behind your door. So let's say you pick one of the doors. He's only going to show you a goat. Now, Monty shows you what's behind. Let's say you pick door number 1. Monty shows you what's behind door number 2, a goat. So that's what it looks like in the framing of it. So the question is do you want to keep your choice or switch? Okay, so you pick door number 1. Monty shows you what's behind door number 2. It's a goat. So now, do you switch to door number 3 or do you keep your choice? Now, most people say, they either say, it doesn't matter because it's 50-50. That's actually what most people say because they think it's been reframed. But let's think about it. Let's dial up our system 2 thinking and do a rational calculation here. At the start, you had a 1/3 chance of picking the car and a 2/3 chance of picking a goat, right? Switching doors is bad only if you first chose the car, which happens only 1/3 of the time. Switching doors is good if you first chose a goat, which happens 2/3 of the time. Thus, the probability of winning by switching is 2/3, or double the odds of not switching. Does that make sense? Another way to think about it, let's say there were 10 doors, behind one of which was a car, behind the 9 others are goats. Monty knows what's behind all 10 doors. You choose door number 1. Monty reveals what's behind doors number 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. They're all goats. Should you switch? Again, of course you're going to switch. Or you can make it 1,000 doors, 1 car, 999 goats. Monty shows you what's behind 998 doors, and they're all goats. What are the chances at the beginning that you got the correct door with the car behind it? 1 out of 1,000, and so forth. Okay, so the reason this is such an interesting story is because in, I think it was 1999, Marilyn Vos Savant, the improbably named Marilyn Vos Savant, considered the world's smartest world's smartest person, is able to solve these incredible intelligence test problems. Wrote a column. So she had a weekly column in Parade magazine. Usually she had puzzles like these kinds of things. So she presented this one as just another puzzle. And she said, most people get this wrong. And here's why. And here's the correct answer. And here's why this is the correct answer. And so on. Parade magazine apparently got the most mail they've ever gotten saying she is wrong. It is not 1/3, 2/3, it's 50-50 after you reframe it, after the first, and the answer is no, it's not. Here it is. Here's why. But the letters were from statisticians, mathematicians, probability experts, gamblers, and so on. All of them were wrong. Okay. It's just one of these weird puzzles that tricks our cognition into misperceiving things. And another one of these is called regression to the mean. For example, if you have 2 tall parents, for every 4 children they have, 3 will be shorter for every one that's taller than them. Same thing with IQ. For 2 smart parents, for every 4 children, 3 will be dumber for every one that's smarter. So they regress to the mean of the overall population. So, of course, 2 tall parents are going to have children that are taller than the overall population mean. But for every 4 children they have, 1 will be taller than their average of the 2 tall parents. 3 will be shorter. That is, the 3 will regress to the overall population mean. And by the way, this is the same thing for shorter, too. 2 short parents, for every 4 kids they have, 3 will be taller than them. That's also regression to the mean. Same thing with 2 smart parents versus 2 not very smart parents. The children's IQs will regress to the overall population mean of IQ. Leonard Mlodinow talks about this in our book, The Drunkard's Walk. With Hollywood films, producers and directors get fired after one bad film, say, even though their films under production go on to success, the failed film is just a regression to the overall mean. Nobody can be a stellar filmmaker every single film. Everybody has a failure. Those failures are just regressing back to the mean of what Hollywood films do. This also explains the Sports Illustrated cover curse. To get on the cover of Sports Illustrated, you have to have had the most spectacular season or game or fight or whatever in your life. What are the chances that you're going to replicate that? Close to zero, right? All the elements have to come together just right to have that super. So you are going to, by definition, almost inevitably regress back to the mean. And maybe your mean. And so you hover around that mean, and sometimes you're above it, sometimes you're below it. Of course, you're not going to be on the cover of Sports Illustrated for being below your mean. So regression to the mean actually explains a lot of what happens in life, where we think we see trend lines that have some kind of deeper causal agent behind them or some causal vector we need to search for, when in fact, as Leonard Mlodinow shows in The Drunkard's Walk, much of it is just randomness. It's just shit happens. Just stuff goes up and down. There's nothing behind it to explain. But of course, with patternicity and agenticity, we tend to look for hidden patterns and invisible agents behind the scenes pulling the strings. Here's another example of this. Humans trying to emulate random sequences will almost never place more than 4 heads or 4 tails in a row. So this is an example of, you just ask subjects, in your mind, flip a coin, heads or tails, and write them down. Heads, tails, heads, tails, heads, tails. Feels pretty random. Maybe you put a couple together, heads, heads, tails, tails, heads, 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 tails, 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 something like that. Okay, so here in green you see the streaks of 4 or more heads, and blue streaks of 4 or more tails. Not very many. Here's what it actually looks like. In true randomness, the probability of at least one string of 5 or more identical outcomes is 0.999, and for 6 it's 0.96. In other words, streaks are what randomness looks like. And that's counterintuitive. Again, we do not evolve on the plains of Africa to understand what long streaks and statistics and probabilities really looks like. But here it's easy to spot which is human generated. It's the one that looks less random. My favorite example of this is when the iPod was released, and it had a feature on it, the iPod Shuffle, that would just randomly select songs from your playlist and just play them. And people were complaining that it wasn't random, that certain songs kept coming up over and over more than our intuitions would allow. And so apparently the Apple engineers had to redesign it so it was less random, so people would feel like it was more random. Okay. So this has to do with the large numbers problem, and a sort of a subtle problem in science. That is, let's say we have a fair coin that will land heads or tails 20 times in a row, only 1 out of 1,000,000 times. Okay? So this seems very improbable, right? But if you have all 300 million adult Americans flip a coin, you sit there all day flipping. Maybe this is what we should be doing to the coronavirus isolation. Run this experiment. By definition, you're going to get 300 of them are going to get 20 heads or 20 tails in a row. It's extremely unlikely outcomes are extremely likely if there are enough probabilities. So again, this is the problem we're facing. Many scientific findings depend on a 5% chance or 5 heads in a row being statistically significantly unlikely. Yet, if you have enough of them, it's going to happen. So this law of large numbers, by the way, explains a lot of what goes on because we're not aware of the huge sample of examples we haven't tested. And you just notice something. You think, what are the odds of that? But like my back-of-the-envelope death dream calculation, if you have enough dreams and enough people dreaming and enough people to know each other, you're going to get some that seem connected. So with a threshold of only 5%, 1 out of 20 studies will inadvertently find evidence for non-existent phenomena in its data. In medicine, a study of 49 of the most cited medical publications from 1990 to 2003 found that the conclusions of 16% were contradicted by subsequent studies. In a 2015 study of the 100 most cited psych papers, only 36% were replicable. Okay, so this shows that even with the rigorous methods of science, it's not infallible. There is this problem. If you have enough people doing enough experiments and you use that 5% criteria. So we probably need to tighten that up. Probably need to try to do more falsification, more replication studies to see if the results are consistently found, because we're in what's loosely called a replication crisis. I don't think it's a crisis, but I think it's the kind of thing we need to pay attention to related to this large numbers problem. Okay, continuing, the birthday probability game. Most people are familiar with this. The odds of getting two people with the same birthday in a room is better than 50% with only 23 people at the party. Okay, so you can see in the graph here, if you have 50 people in a room, 97% probability that two of them will have the same birthday, and 57, 99%. Okay, not the same year of the birthday, just the same date during the year. Okay, and here's the formula that explains why that is. All right, again, this is our system one. Intuitive thinking does not match reality. We require system two. But again, these are kind of tricks to show, like optical illusions, that are a little bit unfair. But it does explain a lot of the modern world. Again, our book, Leonard Mlodinow, The Drunkard's Walk. Love this book. Len's a good friend. The Drunkard's Walk, How Randomness Rules Our Lives. So many good examples of this. Here's the illusion of improbable streaks that Leonard uses that I really like. Bill Miller was considered to be the most successful hedge fund manager of all time. He was called by CNN Money the greatest money manager of our time. Why? Because he beat the S&P 500 15 years in a row. So here's Len's calculations. The odds of beating the S&P 500 for 13 years straight are 1 in 149,012. 14 years, 1 in 372,529. And so this was considered the greatest fund feat in the past 40 years. He's the only one that broke the S&P 500 15 years in a row. Here's the scientific view of this, as Leonard shows. Let's assume a random 1 in 2 chance of beating the S&P 500 per fund manager each year. The probability of Bill Miller beating the S&P 500 15 years in a row, starting in 1991, is 1 in 32,768. But what are we leaving out? Remember our 2x2 matrix with the 4 cells. We're leaving out all the other hedge fund managers. I had no idea until I read Len's book how many there are. There's over 4,000 hedge fund managers. So if we assume a random 1 in 2 chance of beating the S&P 500 per fund manager each year, the probability of someone among all those 4,000 plus managers beating the S&P 500 15 or more years in a row starting each year in the last 40 years, 3/4 or 0.75. In other words, the headline should not be the greatest money manager of our time, but rather expected 15-year run finally occurs, Bill Miller, the lucky beneficiary. Okay, that's a great example. Again, what we're trying to do here is engage our system 2 thinking, which requires some statistics, probabilities, science, critical thinking, skepticism, our intuitions. System 1 thinking does not grasp these things because when we have ever encountered thousands of hedge fund managers betting on a complex system like the stock market in our evolutionary past? Never. Another cognitive bias, the hindsight bias, sometimes called Monday morning quarterbacking. As you know, we all watch football games on Sunday, and then Monday everybody knows what the quarterback should have done, which it happens in hindsight, of course. I mentioned this in the lecture on conspiracy theories. That is, after the fact, you go back and see, well, we should have known the Japanese were going to attack Pearl Harbor because of this memo and that memo. Same thing with President Bush and 9/11 conspiracy theories. After the fact, you can pluck out of that huge body of intel, August 9th, 2001 memo to Condoleezza Rice from the intelligence agency that Al-Qaeda will be attacking the U.S. on U.S. soil. Okay, why didn't we know this was coming? Because there were thousands of pieces of intel. There was so much intelligence that it was just chaos and confusion. After the fact, with hindsight, you go back and connect the dots. As you can watch this on any given day, just tune into one of those business channels like CNBC, and they just sort of run the stock market, and they have a couple of experts sitting there talking about it. They're just, after the fact, coming up with causal explanations. The market is down because of this. The market is up because of that. They're just making stuff up. They're just telling stories in hindsight. And there is what I call the authorized autobiography, which is to say no one can write an autobiography that would be non-biased because of the hindsight, amongst other biases. The hindsight bias means when you are at a certain point in your life and you're looking back to see, why you ended up doing this instead of that, you make up some plausible story to connect the dots in hindsight. Michael Gazzaniga has this whole theory about the left hemisphere narrator, that part of our brain that tries to tell a coherent story to the rest of our brain, that these things that happen for a reason. When in fact it may just be randomness. So you go to this college rather than that college, and you take this class rather than that class, or you meet this person and you marry them, but you didn't meet that person and marry them, and so on. You went to this job interview instead of that job interview. You ended up in that career instead of this career. After the fact, you look back and go, oh boy, it was almost destined, like it was fate or synchronicity that I would go to that college because look, I ended up in this career because I took that class and I met that person and we got married and lived happily ever after, and so on. This is all nonsense. This is just the hindsight bias. Had you gone to some other college and ended up in some other career and met some other person and married them and so on, it all would have looked like this is the right thing to do, and it just all made sense. Okay, this is the problem with the hindsight bias. Then there's my favorite, the self-justification bias, or the tendency to rationalize decisions after the fact, to convince ourselves that what we did was the best thing we could have done. Or as I like to say, smart people believe weird things because they're better at rationalizing their beliefs that they hold for non-smart reasons. Classic studies on this. In one college entrance examination board survey of 829,000 high school seniors, 60% put themselves in the top 10% in ability to get along with others, while 0%, not one, rated themselves below average. That's pretty crazy. I love this one. Now, this is an older study from 1997, U.S. News and World Report, study on who Americans believe were most likely to go to heaven. 52% said Bill Clinton, 60% thought Princess Diana, 65% chose Michael Jordan, 79% selected Mother Teresa, and at 87%, the person most likely to go to heaven was the survey taker. Okay. Obviously, it's also the optimism bias, and studies on religiosity and religious beliefs. Far more people believe in heaven than believe in hell. It's like a 25-point difference in the belief in one versus the belief in the other. That's the self-serving bias. That's the optimism bias. Another bias is what's called the attribution bias. That is the tendency to attribute different causes for our own beliefs and actions than that of others. My fun little slide for that. In fact, we make two different kinds. There's twists on the attribution bias. There's the situational attribution bias, where we identify the cause of someone else's belief or behavior in the environment, such as we may say, well, her success was a result of luck, circumstances, having connection. Versus the dispositional attribution bias, where we identify the cause of our own belief or behavior in our disposition. I'm successful because I'm hardworking, intelligent, and creative. In other words, when we look at other people versus looking at ourselves, we attribute to them different motives and different circumstances and different causal vectors than we do for ourselves. There's another interesting one that I did a little research on called the intellectual attribution bias. Is what I'm calling it that, where we consider our own beliefs as being rationally motivated versus the emotional attribution bias, where we see the beliefs of others as being emotionally driven. So, for example, someone will say, I'm for gun control because statistics show that crime decreases when gun ownership decreases. He's for gun control because he's a bleeding heart liberal who needs to identify with the victim. Or he's against gun control because he's a heartless conservative who needs to feel emboldened by a weapon. Okay, these are real studies. This was actually a paper by Lisa Farwell and Bernard Weiner. Bleeding Hearts and the Heartless, Popular Perceptions of Liberal and Conservative Ideologies. So they discovered in their study on the attribution bias in political attitudes this effect with conservatives justifying their belief with rational arguments but accusing political liberals of being bleeding hearts. Liberals, in turn, offered intellectual justifications for their positions while accusing conservatives of being heartless. Oh boy, we see this in all walks of life. And this is an effect that Frank Soloway and I found in a study that we did on why people believe in God. Now, we studied lots of different factors. For example, you could see, let me turn on my laser pointer here. So here we're looking at correlation between religiosity, to what extent you believe that is you're committed to religion based on whether you were raised religious or not. So those who were raised to be religious were statistically significantly higher on religiosity. Same thing with belief in God. Those who were raised religious were more likely to believe in God. No surprise there. We found an inverse correlation between religiosity and education. The more people were educated, the less likely they are to be religious. Same thing with age, although here we get an interesting effect at around age 70 or so, early 70s. You know, as people get older, they are less likely to believe in God and they're less religious until they hit their early 70s, and then when it goes back up again a little bit, I guess you might say cramming for the final. But the interesting effect was an interaction effect we found between conflict with parents and religiosity, conflict with parents and belief in God, versus harmony with parents. That is to say, we asked subjects, how well did you get along with your parents when you were growing up? Okay, so as you might expect, religiosity and belief in God, for people that were not raised, if they were in high conflict with their parents, they became more religious. They were more likely to believe in God. With low conflict with their parents, if they were raised religiously and they were in low conflict with their parents versus high conflict. So there was an interaction effect here. And our interpretation of this is that you go the opposite direction if you're in high conflict. So if you're raised religious and you're in high conflict with your parents, you become less religious. If you're not raised religious and you're in high conflict with your parents, you become more religious. So you sort of go in the opposite way. It's kind of an intuitive sense of why that might be. But then we got to this intellectual attribution bias versus emotional attribution bias we asked people, why do you believe in God? And why do you think other people believe in God? So here the effect was interesting. Here on the left bars here, we see the difference of the most common reason people gave for why they believe in God was the good design of the universe and the experience of God. But the biggest ones for why they say other people believe in God is comfort and purpose to life, gives comfort, purpose to life, and they were raised to believe in God. Or in this one, faith and need to believe. This was fear of death. Nobody says they believe, by the way, nobody says they believe in God because they're afraid of dying. Contra to the terror management theory, which I'm skeptical of, but that's another lecture. In other words, here, people are saying, I believe in God for perfectly rational intellectual reasons, the good design. And these were essays that we read and had coded, and that me and Frankie, we had a couple graduate students read and code them. We had a high inter-rater reliability in this study. Anyways, super interesting finding. But basically, you could tell the people who said they believe in God and the reasons they gave were very intellectual. You could tell they'd been watching science programs and reading books by people like Stephen Hawking and so on. So they had an idea, but the Big Bang, the fine-tunedness of the universe, and they talked a lot about that. But if you ask them, why do you think other people believe in God? They didn't say, well, because of the Big Bang or the cosmological argument or the fine-tunedness argument. No, because they were raised to believe, or they need to believe, or they're afraid of dying, or they need some purpose in their life. It's interesting that people don't say that about their own beliefs. Okay, that's the attribution bias at work there. Okay, kind of wrapping things up here. The blind spot bias is the tendency to recognize the power of cognitive biases in other people, to be blind to their influence upon our own beliefs. It's a little bit like the attribution bias. Princeton University psychologist Emily Pronin and her colleagues, in their experiment, subjects were randomly assigned high or low scores on a social intelligence test. Those given the high marks rated the test fair and more useful than those receiving low marks. When asked if it was possible that they had been influenced by the score on the test, subjects responded that other participants had been far more biased than they were. Even when subjects admit to having such a bias as being a member of a partisan group, says Pronin, this is apt to be accompanied by the insistence that, in their own case, their status has been uniquely enlightening. Indeed, that it was the lack of such enlightenment that is making those on the other side of the issue take their misguided position. In other words, if you explain to people these cognitive biases, then they become better at recognizing them in other people, but they still fail to recognize it in themselves. It's kind of she called it the bias blind spot, sort of a bias, that you're biased about your own biases versus being unbiased about other people's biases. And of course, the mother of all cognitive biases, the confirmation bias, is the tendency to seek and find confirming evidence for one's beliefs and to ignore disconfirming evidence. This is why this is called motivated reasoning. We're motivated to look for just confirming evidence. Back to Popper, in science, we have to look for disconfirming evidence, falsification. Okay, my fun examples of this are when I was in 9th grade, there was this meme going around that Paul McCartney was dead. He was killed in a car accident, and so all of a sudden everybody was looking for clues, like in the Beatles, Sgt. Pepper's album cover. You could see the 4 Beatles here are at a funeral, and here's the 4 younger Beatles in their early 60s days. This is in the late 60s. And you see somebody has a hand here over Paul's head. This is supposed to be the sign of the death symbol or something like that at this funeral. Then there's the famous cover of Abbey Road where allegedly the boys are dressed as, John in his sort of a minister's white coat and pants, and Ringo is like dressed as the pallbearer, and Paul is the corpse. He's in bare feet. He's got a cigarette. And George is, like the grave digger in his jeans. And other signs, like if you look at this Volkswagen here, if you look up close at the license plate number, you'll see it says 28 if. Paul would have been 28 if he hadn't died. And the police cars in the background here. I mean, this is just crazy patternicity stuff. But it's an example of the confirmation bias where you're just looking for examples. At the back of Beatles, Abbey Road album, see a skull here. Here it is, enlarged. And then 3 Beatles. See, 3 Beatles, because, the 4th Beatle, Paul, was killed. Same effect with the Bible Code. This was a New York Times best-selling book by this journalist named Michael Drosnin. So here's the theory, that if you take the original Hebrew Bible, there's no such thing, but let's just say that there is an original script, the very first one, and it's perfect, so forth. And you lay out the entire string of Hebrew letters, just a long string, as long as it goes like this. And then you pick a number, like let's make it a block of type. We'll make it, I don't know, however many letters across this is, and that's going to be the N, the skip code N. So let's say it's 13 letters across, and then we take every 13 letters and you look for patterns in the block of type. And by the way, this is done with no particular rules. The patterns can be up and down, left and right, diagonal in any angle you want. You can have them skip letters and so on. And you look for things like, here it is, twin towers, airplane, terror, martyr, twofold strikes, will collapse, will burn. The Bible, let's be clear what the claim is. The Old Testament, written thousands of years ago, somehow they knew about 9/11. Okay, this is crazier than the 9/11 truthers. Anyway, I wrote one of my Scientific American columns about this. I called it Codified Claptrap, pointing out, for example, that here's the passages that allegedly show that that President Kennedy is to die in Dallas. So, again, the Old Testament allegedly predicted that President Kennedy would be shot in Dallas and so on, based on these particular word strings. Okay, obviously, this block of type here that I'm just picking out, the block width is entirely arbitrary. It could be pick every 70th letter, 20th letter, every 2,692nd letter, whatever. And people have done this in like War and Peace and other books and found all kinds of interesting patterns. Nobody's claiming that War and Peace has any prophetic nature to it. Anyway, that's not the point of this example. The point of this example is that, back up. So Drosnin was not too happy with my column, so he wrote to Scientific American to complain. And so we said, you can write a letter to the editor, we'll publish that. Anyway, so we did. And then I wrote a response to his response, and we had a little exchange there, which was nice. Then I got an interesting letter from this guy named John Byrne, who is a comic book illustrator and writer. and he writes, reading Michael Drosnin's response to Michael Shermer's column on the Bible Code and its ability to accurately predict the future, I could not help but laugh. I've been a writer and illustrator of comic books for the past 30 years, and in that time I've predicted the future so many times in my work, my colleagues have actually taken to referring to it as the burn curse. It began in the late 1970s. While working on a Spider-Man series titled Marvel Team Up, I did a story about a blackout in New York. There was a blackout the month the issue went on sale, 6 months after I drew it. While working on Uncanny X-Men, I hit Japan with a major earthquake, and again the real thing happened the month the issue hit the stands. Now, these things are fairly easy to predict, but consider this. While working on the relaunch of Superman for DC Comics, I had the Man of Steel fly to the rescue when disaster beset the NASA space shuttle. The Challenger tragedy happened almost immediately thereafter, with time, fortunately, for the issue in question to be redrawn, substituting a space plane for the shuttle. Most recent and chilling came when I was writing and drawing Wonder Woman, and did a story in which the title character was killed as a prelude to her becoming a goddess. The cover for that issue was done as a newspaper front page with the headline, Princess Diana Dies. Diana is Wonder Woman's real name. That issue went on sale on a Thursday. The following Saturday, I don't have to tell you, do I? My ability as a prognosticator, like Drosnin's, would seem assured, provided, of course, we reference only the above and skip over the hundreds of other comic books I have produced, which featured all manner of catastrophes, large and small, which did not come to pass. Okay, so I love that example because, again, back to our 2x2 matrix with the cells, we're only noticing the comic books stories that came true with match some real world example. We're not looking at all the ones that didn't come true, all the events that happened that were not predicted in anybody's comic books, and so forth, right? So again, confirmation bias, motivated reasoning, it can be very deceptive. I use this to explain how psychics talk to the dead, how astrologers and tarot card readers work, and so on. And Bill Nye, the Science Guy, and I did a show for one of his series on this. So I'm going to play that clip now to show how this works. It's a pretty fascinating example of several of these effects going on. Let's see. Okay, where did my Bill Nye the Science Guy go? Here it is, right there.
There are people who say they can connect with the spirits of the deceased and that they can predict the future. Those are pretty extraordinary claims. And the proof? Well, it's always been less than extraordinary. Now, some people say that extrasensory perception is beyond science, and maybe it is. But here at Nye Labs, we conducted a little experiment to see just how easy it is to make it look like you have psychic powers. We invited Dr. Michael Shermer, the publisher of Skeptic magazine, to come and read people's futures.
There's something, I'm getting something about a scar on your knee, on your left knee, or you scraped your knees or something.
I scraped my knee.
You did?
Yeah.
Was this recently or?
A couple of weeks ago.
Uh-huh.
The thing about the knee was funny because I haven't scraped my knees in like 12 years, and I did just a couple of weeks ago. I fell down.
So this card tells us that there is a dominant. There's two things going on here. There is some spirituality in your life, either traditional religion or, if not traditional, at least a strong component of some sort of spirituality. Does that make any sense? How does that?
In different ways. Like when I was younger, my father was a Baptist minister.
Uh-huh. Well, there you go.
That might be it. He wasn't stretching so much. I think he was pulling from things that were coming out of the cards rather than pulling things from me.
There's, there's just a couple of weird little things I'm getting. I'm seeing a white car. I don't know what a white car means. If this is somebody in your family or your friend or something like that.
My grandma has a white car, and my friend from high school has a white car.
I started off saying I'm getting a couple of people here that are influenced. So I wonder if this other one with the white car thing is the grandmother. I wonder if it's grandmother sort of coming through in a sense.
Something that he picked up on that did surprise me was about the white car. I don't really know where that came from. I think that I will think about my grandma a little bit and maybe talk to her a little bit more.
So, Michael, you've never done this before?
Nope, never done it.
How long did you spend preparing for this session?
I prepared yesterday, basically one day. I got a book on cold reading. I took a few notes. I went online and I read some stuff on palms so I could memorize the lines, so I at least sound like I know what I'm talking about. If I can do this in one day, anybody can do it.
Why do you think it is that people are just drawn to this?
There is this transcendent idea that we can somehow transcend the here and now and connect to the other side. There's no evidence that there is such a thing, but if somebody claims that there is, that pretty much is all that's needed with a handful of hits to convince people you can do it.
So describe a hit.
A hit would be anything that the client thinks is accurate or true. But what they don't realize is that these things are true for almost everybody. The skin knee, the white car. You see, what's going on here is the psychic's not doing the reading. The person is doing the reading. And here's the key. They remember the hits and forget the misses. And they think the psychic got the information, but they gave it to the psychic. Okay. Now, a lot of this comes from a book called The Full Facts Book of Cold Reading. And the idea is that you're doing a cold reading. So I need to talk a little bit about that for a moment. Because so many people think that there's something to it. And because the psychic appears to get a particular hit, incredibly unusual. It's not unusual when you find out how this actually works. That is, a cold reading is you read somebody cold you've never met before, and you throw a lot of points out to them, and you wait for them to respond in a positive way, such that well, let's get this weird screen out of here for a second. It probably looks kind of weird. So you're looking for hits that the person makes. So the confirmation bias, reason I use this example is because we've done other studies on this where I'll tape record like an hour-long session, and the psychic will have hundreds of comments, questions for the person getting the reading, and the person will confirm maybe half a dozen of them is true, and those are the only ones they'll remember. They'll forget all the others. So they're motivated in their reasoning to find confirmations if they are hoping to make a connection with a lost loved one, that sort of thing, which is why most people go to these things. Or they call the psychic hotline because they want to talk to somebody because they're feeling blue or depressed, and so on. So they're motivated to see that it works. In the case of like the law of large numbers, if you give enough hits, you're bound, if you give enough statements, you're bound to get some hits, right? But more than that, there's what's called warm reading, which I got from Ian Rowland's book, again, the Full Fact Books of Cold Reading, Ian Rowland, that there's a lot of things that are true for most people. Like that, I mentioned the skin knee. Where did I come up with that? I got that from Ian. Everybody has skinned their knee at some point in their life. I didn't say when she skinned her knee. I just said I'm getting something about a skinned knee. Yeah, I skinned my knee. Oh, okay. Lucky me. It was recent rather than old. Or there's a number 2 in your address. Or if it's a woman, you have an earring and you're missing the match to it. If it's a guy, maybe you have a broken power tool you're keeping. You're hoping to fix it someday. Calendars early in the year. You have an out-of-date calendar in January on your fridge or something like that. Photos of your loved ones that are on the fireplace mantle, or in your wallet you have some pictures of loved ones. These are the kinds of things that are true for most people. Like I once spent an entire day with James Van Prague, who's this psychic medium that allegedly talks to the dead. By the way, as Penn and Teller point out, anybody can talk to the dead. It's getting the dead to talk back. That's the hard part. Anyway, jokes aside. I spent an entire day with this psychic medium named James Van Prague. He didn't know who I was, and so I got a reading like the rest of the people. I noticed that all the guys in the room, he assumed we were all there to connect with a lost loved one. Now, in the case of young, say, men in their 20s, 30s, and 40s, it's likely to be a grandfather or father. With all of us, he said, the watch. There's something about you have his watch. He wants you to know he's connected to you through his watch, this kind of thing. I thought, wow, that's incredible, because that's true for me. When my father died, I kept his watch. And then I noticed that happened again and again and again. I thought, oh, all guys keep their dad's watch, okay, or grandfather's watch. All right, so those are warm reading examples. They're true for most people. Then there's hot reading, where you actually cheat. You get information online or whatever. That wasn't the case back in the 80s and 90s, but now maybe somebody could do that. I don't think we really need that to explain how this works. I think all it can be done through cold reading, warm reading, and then the confirmation bias, where you only remember the hits and forget the misses. When you actually record the total body of data that the person generated in a single reading, the hits are they're like 1%, 2%. It's nothing to get excited about. So let's put all that together, and this whole idea of patternicity, cognitive biases, the confirmation bias, the power of expectation, and then what happens when expectations are violated, with a final fun clip here. Okay, let's see. Put this big screen, and we'll end with this, and then I'll have a few closing remarks.
This is the venue they chose for their fake auditions for an advert for lip balm.
We're hoping that we can use part of this in a national commercial, right? And this is a test on some lip balms that we have over here. And these are our models who are going to help us, Roger and Matt. And we have our own lip balm, and we have a leading brand. Would you have any problem kissing our models to test them?